Hi, I'm Phoebe. And my dad once stood up at his own birthday party, raised a glass, and said I wasn't even blood. They cropped me out of family photos, labeled me caregiver at my mother's funeral, left my name off the will, twice. But it wasn't the rejection that cut deepest. It was the silence that followed. Why did my aunt leave me everything they tried to take? Why did my sister say, "You made me look like the villain," when I hadn't spoken a word? And what was really on that tape they never wanted played? I didn't want to go. That house had always made me feel like a stranger with borrowed keys. But when Dad turned 68 and Dell made a show of texting me the invite with, "Figured it'd be weird if you weren't there," I knew what was expected. It wasn't a gesture of goodwill, it was an opportunity to make sure I stayed in the shadows. I said yes because some part of me, however buried, still wanted to be counted. The house looked more polished than I remembered. Fresh paint, flower arrangements in every corner, silver balloons bouncing against the ceiling like they belonged there more than I did. Everyone wore smiles that had been practiced. The dining room had been transformed into something that belonged in a lifestyle magazine. The long table stretched past the fireplace, decorated with crystal goblets and name cards. Mine read, "Phoebe, cousin," scribbled hastily in Sharpie. I was seated at the far end, near the kitchen entrance where servers brushed past me with trays of ribs and baked beans. Far from Dad, far from the action. I kept my coat on. The wine was already flowing by the time I arrived. I pretended I didn't notice how a few cousins looked me up and down like I had tracked in dirt. When someone stood to toast Dad, they started off with something lighthearted about the legacy of sterling blood and how proud they were to carry it forward. That's when Dad, seated at the head of the table like a king carved out of bitterness, raised his glass and said too casually, "Well, not all of us carry it. Phoebe was never really part of us. She's not even blood." The air changed. A fork clinked against a plate, but no one moved. One cousin let out a quiet, "Jesus, Maha," but nobody contradicted him. Not Dell, not the aunt who used to braid my hair. Not even the uncle who still owed me an apology for what he said when Sophie left me her old pickup. I didn't react. I didn't drop my fork or leave. I didn't cry. I sliced my chicken like the words hadn't landed. But inside, something cracked. Something that had held me upright for years started folding in on itself, slow and quiet like a house caving from within. After dinner, while people lingered in the living room, I slipped away into the hallway. I needed air, but I didn't go outside. Instead, I wandered toward the staircase, to the wall where all the family photos were arranged like trophies. There it was, a framed shot from Christmas when I was 22. I remembered that day. We were in matching flannel, standing in front of the fireplace, laughing so hard our eyes disappeared. Except now, my part of the photo was gone, literally cropped out. The frame held everyone else, Dell in the center, the twins next to her, Dad with his arm around Aunt Miriam. The middle where I stood was snipped clean. They hadn't replaced the photo. They just trimmed me out like I'd never been there. I leaned in close, studying the edge, seeing the jagged line where the scissors must have slipped. My fingertips hovered just above the glass. I felt no tears, just the sharp twist of understanding. "I guess that solves the mystery," I whispered to no one. They hadn't just moved on. They had edited me out. From the other side of the wall, I heard voices. Dell's laugh. Always just a bit too loud. I didn't want to eavesdrop, but I couldn't stop myself from listening. "She still shows up, like a lost dog," Dell said to someone I couldn't see. "Sophie kept throwing her bones, and she thought it meant something." Laughter. Then, "You'd think she'd get the hint by now." I stepped around the corner and looked her dead in the eye. She blinked, but only for a second. "Didn't know strays had ears," she said, lifting her champagne flute. Didn't know hyenas talked politics, I replied without blinking. The room went still. No one laughed. No one came to my defense. I didn't wait for her response. I turned and walked out, my boots clicking on the floor like punctuation marks in a story I was rewriting. On the drive home, the Wyoming highway stretched in front of me like a cold ribbon of escape. The stars above felt closer than the people I had just left behind. I kept both hands on the wheel, the radio off. I didn't need noise to remind me how much I'd been left out of. For years I had shown up. Holidays, funerals, family events where I brought side dishes no one touched. I had laughed at bad jokes, helped clean up after others, written birthday cards that went unanswered. I used to think maybe if I did enough, said the right things, they'd stop seeing me as a placeholder. But I had spent my whole life knocking on a door that had no intention of being opened. Somewhere near the turnoff to Sophie's ranch, I whispered, "If they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair." It was a quote I remembered from Shirley Chisholm. But that night, it felt like prophecy. I turned off my headlights before pulling into the long gravel driveway. Sophie had taught me that, never wake the land with noise. Her old porch light flickered like a nod. I parked beneath the willow tree, got out slowly, and let the quiet hold me. The stars didn't care who I was, neither did the soil, and for the first time, I started to wonder what life would look like if I stopped asking permission to belong. I hadn't seen the last of that family, but the next time, I wouldn't be the one crawling. 2 weeks passed before I returned to that house again, not out of nostalgia, and certainly not out of duty, just necessity. My mother had died, and I was expected to stand in a room full of people who had already decided I didn't belong. I wasn't told directly. A second cousin messaged me on Facebook with a simple, "Just in case you hadn't heard, the service is Friday." It stung, but I wasn't surprised. The parking lot was already full when I pulled in. Men in dark jackets and women in thick scarves gathered near the chapel entrance, speaking in hushed tones as if grief had a volume limit. I stepped out of my truck and straightened my coat, brushing off the faint trace of dust from the ride in. As I approached the double doors, a woman holding a clipboard stopped me with a forced smile. "Name?" she asked gently, pen ready. "Phoebe," I said. "Phoebe Sterling." She looked down the list, her eyes scanning. "Ah, yes, you're already signed in." She pointed to a line. I stepped closer. Next to my name, it read, "Phoebe Sterling, caregiver." I stared at it for a few seconds, long enough for the woman to shift awkwardly. "There must be a mistake," I said quietly. "I'm her daughter." The woman hesitated, then said, "I think the list came from Dell. She coordinated everything." Of course she did. I didn't argue. I didn't ask for a correction. I stepped back, nodded once, and moved toward the far pews in the back. The front row was marked for immediate family. There were no open seats anyway. I stood in silence, hands clasped in front of me. They didn't scream me out of the room. They just renamed me. That's how people erase you these days. Not with fire or fury, but with neat handwriting and controlled tones. People don't always kill you with cruelty, I thought. Sometimes they just erase you gently. 1 week later, I found myself sitting in a stiff leather chair inside the lawyer's office. It smelled like coffee and old carpet. Mahogany panels lined the walls. A photo of a sailboat sat on a side table, someone else's dream, someone else's freedom. Dell was there, of course. So were 2 of my brothers, both in sports coats they hadn't buttoned right. I was the only one who looked like she didn't belong. Again. The lawyer cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began reading. "To my eldest daughter, Delilah Sterling, I leave the house and surrounding property." She didn't react, not even a smirk. "To my son, Michael Sterling, I leave the farm machinery and all vehicle titles." Michael nodded, as if he had just confirmed a lunch order. To my son, Grant Sterling, I leave the family antiques and the coin collection. My breath held for a beat. There was silence. Then, that concludes the reading. That was it. No mention of me. Not even a cursory phrase. No with love. No regret. Not even excluded. Just absence. Cold, methodical absence. I looked around the room. No one made eye contact. They didn't shift in discomfort. They weren't embarrassed for me. If anything, they looked relieved, like a room that had finally been swept clean of a stain. Sometimes silence is the most violent scream, I thought, standing. I didn't wait for polite farewells. I left before they could pretend to feel awkward. Let them digest their inheritance in peace. The wind had picked up when I stepped outside. The chill slid beneath my coat, but it was the kind of cold I welcomed. It cleared things out, stripped you bare so you could start again. Back at my rental, I dropped my purse on the table and pulled out the shoebox from under my bed. It was taped shut, worn at the corners, but still held together. I hadn't opened it in years. Inside were letters, dozens, all from Sophie. Birthday cards, holiday notes, just because messages. Some were scribbled on grocery store stationery. Others were folded pieces of notebook paper, always in her same curving script. They weren't profound. They didn't quote scripture or preach life lessons. Most were simple. Roxy, don't forget the way the sun hits the back fence in June. That's the real blessing. Or, your laugh on the phone the other day stayed with me all evening. That was enough. No one else had written to me like that. Not in decades. I used to think blood was thicker than water, I said aloud. Turns out ink, from lawyers, washes away blood just fine. I opened my journal and wrote 3 words. Find your own. Sophie once told me, just because they don't claim you doesn't mean you don't exist. She'd said it over tea, the kind she steeped too long, with too much honey. I remember brushing it off then, thinking she was trying to cheer me up. But now it felt like prophecy, like a map I should have followed sooner. That night I didn't tell anyone, not Bree, not Connor, not even the one friend who still texted me holiday memes. I packed a lunch, cleaned my boots, checked the oil in my truck, and left before the sun had fully risen. I wasn't going to fight them for the past. Let them keep their scripted legacy, the inheritance penned by erasers. But I was done letting them define my future. I tried calling Sophie, even though it had been a while. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Her voice came through, cheerful as ever. This is Sophie. Say something useful, or say it twice. Beep. Hey, it's me, I said. Just wanted to say I get it now. Thank you for always seeing me. The road to the ranch was slick from overnight rain. Wipers danced across the windshield, smearing the view but not obscuring it. Past the hill, I saw the old cattle pens, half rusted but still standing proud. The barn roof had a new dent, likely from wind, and the mailbox, still hanging crooked, Sophie's last name stenciled in fading white. I parked near the side fence and didn't get out right away. The quiet pressed in, the kind of quiet that doesn't suffocate, but steadies you. I closed my eyes, took a breath that came from deeper than I'd expected, and whispered, "This isn't my inheritance, it's my rescue." The papers erased me, but Sophie's silence. It felt like a hand extended in the dark. Morning fog still clung to the edges of the fence line when I pulled up to Sophie's ranch. The gravel crunched under my tires the way it always had, but the sound felt more like memory than motion. I sat there a moment, engine ticking softly in the silence, before cutting it off and opening the door. The air was sharp, clean, and steady. I hadn't realized how much I missed breathing in a place that didn't make me feel like I needed to shrink. The dog, Murphy, her old blue heeler, barked once from the porch but stopped mid-stride when he saw me. His tail gave one slow wag, then two, before he trotted over and nudged my leg with his nose. We used to walk the fence line together when Sophie needed an extra pair of eyes and I needed an excuse to avoid the dinner table. I gave him a pat and murmured, "Still watching the place, huh?" Inside the barn, nothing had changed. Dust had settled on the beams, and cobwebs draped the corners, but my old toolbox still sat on the shelf like it was waiting for me to come home. I ran my fingers along the top, flipped the latch, and opened it. The wrench I'd dropped at 19 when Murphy spooked a calf was still there, rusted, but exactly where I left it. Without really thinking, I picked up a broom and started sweeping. The motion was rhythmic, grounding. I moved stall to stall, brushing away cobwebs and hay like I had something to prove to the ghosts. If they didn't want me in their version of the past, fine. I'd build mine from the truth. Behind an old cabinet in the tack room, something caught my eye. A wooden chest I didn't recognize, carved into the lid in Sophie's careful handwriting. "For Roxy, keep this." The latch creaked, hesitant at first, then gave way. Inside was a sealed envelope with my name on it and the words, "Vision, 1998. I sat cross-legged on the barn floor and opened it slowly. Inside was my old blueprint, hand-drawn when I was 16. I'd forgotten how seriously I took it back then. I had mapped out new paddocks, designed rotating pasture gates, sketched out a windmill system to redirect runoff. At the time, it was nothing more than a fantasy scribbled in pencil. But Sophie had laminated it, and on the back, she'd written in permanent marker, "You saw this place not just as it was, but what it could become. That mattered more than you knew." Tears came fast, not out of heartbreak, but recognition. To be seen like that, not pitied, not corrected, just seen, was a kind of love I hadn't known I'd been starved for. I laid the blueprint out on the barn table, smoothing the corners. I took out my phone, snapped a photo, and whispered, "It's still mine." "The best way to predict the future is to create it," Peter Drucker once said. I never understood that quote until now. Sophie didn't just protect my dream, she preserved it, gave it a place to grow. Later that afternoon, I drove into town to pick up fencing supplies. The air at the co-op was different, heavier, like people had something on their minds but didn't want to be the first to say it. That's when I heard her. "She's not family." Dell's voice carried through the metal aisle like it had rehearsed cruelty. "Never was. Just a stray Sophie kept around to feel noble." She was talking to Joe Rivers, a rancher from across town. He didn't say much, just gave a tight-lipped nod, like he agreed but didn't want to get dragged in. I didn't stop. I didn't confront. I walked past them, slow and straight, head high. My boots echoed harder than I meant, but I didn't apologize for the sound. When I got back to the ranch, I didn't slam the truck door. I didn't cry. I just went straight to the kitchen, opened my journal, and wrote one sentence. "I won't fight you for approval you never meant to give." It was more than a mantra. It was a boundary I'd never dared to set before. That night, I spread the blueprint again on Sophie's table and pulled out a fresh pad of tracing paper. I started adding new lines, solar panel placements, grant numbers I'd looked up last year but never submitted, contact info for women-led agricultural co-ops in 3 counties. Legacy isn't about blood. It's what survives you when everything else is gone. And I was going to make sure this place didn't just survive, it was going to thrive. I drew for hours, pencil scraping in quiet defiance. I didn't need anyone's permission to dream, especially not from people who couldn't see beyond their own narrow lineages. When I finished, I made a list at the bottom of the page. Things I will not forget again. The funeral program that erased me, the will that named everyone but me. Dell's voice behind my back, Sophie's voice, on paper, in memory, in faith. I set the list beside the blueprint and folded them together, gently. They were both maps now. And if they were writing me out, then I'd make sure they had no pages left to stand on. I found out Sophie had died from Marlene Foster, the widow who lives 2 fences down from her land. I was dropping off extra eggs when she leaned over the porch railing and said, "Sorry about your aunt, honey. I imagine the funeral will be beautiful." My mouth dried. "What funeral?" She tilted her head, surprised. "Didn't you see the paper?" I stopped at the corner store on the way home and picked up the local rag. Page 6. A small, tasteful obituary with a black and white photo of Sophie laughing in her garden hat. They listed her surviving relatives. My name wasn't among them. I read it again to be sure, as if a second glance might summon me into the family tree. The wake was that afternoon, 4 o'clock. No mention of closed services or invite only. I stared at the clock on the kitchen stove. 2:17. I pulled out the only black dress I owned. It was wrinkled, hanging next to coats I hadn't touched since spring. I grabbed the quilt Sophie had made for me the Christmas I turned 24, the one with fabric scraps from her old ranch clothes, stitched together with stories she never told aloud. "They may control the guest list," I said into the mirror as I brushed my hair, "but they don't own my grief." I parked 2 blocks away from the church, not out of shame, but because I didn't want anyone controlling even how I arrived. I walked slowly, the quilt folded in my arms, held like it had weight beyond the cotton. At the front steps, a man in a black suit stood with a clipboard. He wasn't rude, just official, the kind of polite that comes with distance. "Hi, can I help you?" "I'm here for the service," I said, adjusting my grip on the quilt. He glanced down the list. "Name?" "Phoebe. Phoebe Sterling." He scanned the column, then looked back at me with a neutral face. "I'm sorry, you're not listed. This is a private family event. I'm her niece." "I understand, ma'am, but I can't allow anyone not on the approved list." Through the stained glass door behind him, I saw shadows shifting inside. A figure turned slightly, and for a moment I caught Dell's profile. She didn't look surprised to see me. She didn't look regretful either, just indifferent. She turned her head away as if I were nothing more than noise at the edge of her day. I stepped back. The man offered a small, practiced frown. "There's a viewing tomorrow, open to the public." "No need," I said softly. I walked to the edge of the steps, laid the quilt across the railing, smoothed its edge. I whispered to it, "You knew I'd come." And then I left. No grand scene, no raised voice or breaking glass, just the quiet dignity of a woman who knew when she wasn't invited, but refused to stay invisible. 3 days later, while folding laundry in the ranch's mudroom, I saw Dell's face on my phone. The live notification banner read, "Women in Ag Empowerment Honoring Sophie's Legacy." I tapped in. Dell stood near the old barn, my barn now, with her hand resting against the side like she'd built it from her own backbone. Behind her, the trees that Sophie and I had planted swayed gently in the fall wind. She wore a tasteful navy coat, her hair pinned back, eyes glassy. "Aunt Sophie believed in strong women," she said to the camera, her voice thick with rehearsed sentiment. "She believed in second chances, in rebuilding. That's what today is about." Applause rose faintly in the background. Women in boots and branded vests nodded, clapping politely. My fingers curled into my palm. There was a banner fluttering near the barn entrance. Blanco Family Preserve. Blanco. Her last name. Not Sophie's, not mine. I didn't cry. I laughed. One dry, sharp burst that startled Murphy, who lay sleeping at my feet. I took a screenshot, then another. Then I hit record on my phone and filmed the last 60 seconds, just in case the internet lost it later. "You want a legacy battle, Dell?" I muttered. "Fine. Let's test that theory in court. The next morning, I drove out to the ranch gate, my gate. The one Sophie walked me through the week she signed the deed over to me. It had been painted, new hinges, fresh stain, and right in the middle, another sign. Blanco Family Preserve, Est, 2023. There was no paperwork, no legal notice, no transfer filed. Just a sign and a camera crew, and Dell's talent for rewriting things that weren't hers to touch. I didn't rip it down. I didn't take photos. I turned around, drove back down the dirt road, and parked beside the southern fence line where no one would see my truck. I walked the boundary slowly. Murphy followed, tail low but alert. Every post I passed felt like Sophie's breath was still in the wood. At the far end of the property, where the fence dipped toward the river, I met Bree. She'd texted earlier and said she'd be around. She handed me a paper bag. This was meant for Sophie's service. I brought it to the church, but they said it was handled. I opened it carefully. Inside was a mason jar of peach jam, Sophie's favorite. Bree looked down, then up. You were always the one who brought it to her. Nobody else ever remembered. The lump in my throat didn't come from grief. It came from gratitude, from being remembered. Thank you, I said. We stood in silence for a minute before she hugged me, tight and wordless, and walked back toward her truck. I drove home without turning on the radio. The air didn't need commentary. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and opened my journal. At the top of the page, I wrote, "She wasn't yours to brand." Then underlined it. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but I wouldn't play Dell's game in the spotlight. If she wanted war in public, I'd wage mine in the soil, quiet, deliberate, unstoppable. I didn't lose her. You just tried to steal her while I was still grieving. 3 mornings after I'd left that quilt on the church steps, a white envelope showed up in my mailbox. My name was handwritten, the kind of cursive you don't see much anymore, slanted and neat, with confidence in every loop. No return address, just a stamp from Casper and the name Nora Green, pressed faintly in blue ink at the corner. I stood at the kitchen counter, staring at it for longer than I needed to. My coffee had gone cold. It wasn't fear, exactly. More like a preparation. I'd gotten good at keeping expectations low. It's how I stayed standing. Inside, a single sheet of thick cream paper. Formal, but personal. Nora, Sophie's lawyer. She requested my presence for a private reading of Sophie's final letter and estate arrangements. Her tone was gentle, but direct. It was not an invitation. It was a fact. Sophie had left me something, and Nora had been instructed to deliver it in person. The drive to Casper took just over an hour, but I barely noticed the landscape. Mountains flanked the highway, dust clung to my tires, but I was somewhere else entirely, mentally picking through the attic of every conversation I'd had with Sophie, every glance she'd given me that felt like more than small talk, every moment that might explain why she'd done this quietly, why she hadn't warned me. Nora's office was the kind of place that smelled like old leather and calm arguments. Dark wood walls, brass fixtures, and silence you didn't question. She welcomed me with a nod and motioned to the chair across from her desk. No receptionist, no buzzing phones, just us and the weight in the air. She didn't waste time. She opened a folder and began to read in a tone stripped of drama but full of weight. I, Sophrona Wise, being of sound mind and full intent, do leave all land, livestock, personal assets, and holdings in entirety to my niece, Roxalana True, because she is not just my niece, she is my chosen legacy. I didn't breathe. My ears rang slightly. I had expected, maybe, a book, a shawl, some token wrapped in nostalgia, not the land, not the cattle, and certainly not the CADILLAC. Nora looked up, watching me like she expected me to ask if there'd been a mistake. She was very clear, she said softly, sliding a sealed envelope toward me. She left you this, too. The envelope was thick, the kind that held secrets too large for single sentences. Sophie's handwriting again. This time just my name. No title, no apology, just me. I opened it slowly, unfolding the pages with the same care I'd use on a broken wing. Sophie's words greeted me with warmth I hadn't realized I needed. Roxy, you never asked me for anything. You just showed up. You brought fence wire and peach jam and silence when I needed it most. You loved this land even when it was dry. You protected what others ignored. You didn't ask for this. That's why you deserve it. She went on to describe the hours I'd spent out in the vineyard, fixing irrigation lines without being told, tending the calves during a snowstorm. She remembered everything. You didn't need to be named to matter, but I'm naming you now. When I finished reading, I held the paper in both hands, terrified it would vanish. Like it wasn't real, like someone might walk in and say it had all been a mix-up. But Nora just sat quietly, giving me time. Back at the ranch, I couldn't sit still. I opened every drawer in Sophie's office like I was looking for breath, not paper. And then I found them, in the bottom drawer, under a stack of old ledgers. Envelopes, dozens of them, all addressed to My Roxy, labeled by year. Birthday cards. I pulled out the one from the year I turned 29. It had a hand-drawn goat in a party hat and the words, "Still standing, still stubborn, must be the wise in you." Each one had a note. Some silly, some full of grace, pressed wildflowers from the back fields, doodles of tractors and boots. One simply said, "Don't let them shrink you down to what makes them comfortable." I pressed that one to my chest and sat on the floor of the office, surrounded by years she had remembered me when no one else had. I didn't cry for her being gone. I cried because I'd never been invisible to her. Not once. At sunrise, I walked the full edge of the property line. Sophie's hat sat on my head, a bit too big, the brim dipping over my eyes like it used to on her. Dew clung to my boots, and Murphy trotted ahead, occasionally looking back to make sure I was still behind him. I passed the vineyard rows, now heavy with promise, and the barn where she'd kept the truck I learned to drive stick in. I paused at the far fence post where she used to say, "This land listens if you walk slow enough." I wasn't sure if I believed that, but I slowed anyway. Back at the house, I took the letter and one of the birthday cards and placed them in a frame on the mantel, right where the family photo used to sit before they'd cropped me out of it. Then I opened the barn doors. Connor, our old ranch hand, had just pulled up. "You're here early," he said, stepping out of his truck. "We've got work to do," I told him. "Sophie wouldn't want this place quiet." He nodded. That was all. No congratulations, no speeches, just shared history and hands that knew what came next. They'd forgotten to write me in, but Sophie had left me the pen. She chose me before the world ever did. And now it was my turn to choose back. The call from Bree came just after sunrise. I was in the middle of feeding the cattle, grain spilling from the scoop as Murphy barked at a lazy steer chewing too close to the fence. "You need to see what they published," she said, voice tight. "It's on the Tribune's site. Front page." I washed my hands at the outdoor spigot and grabbed my phone with wet fingers. The headline sat bold, confident, and venomous across the screen. "Nieceless grifter inherits legacy. Community cries foul." I clicked. Paragraph after paragraph filled the screen. Phrases like "manipulated a vulnerable elder," "abused familial trust," and "suspected coercion" jumped out at me like knives. There were quotes, anonymous of course, from someone close to the family, and a supposed ranch employee I'd never even heard of. "She moved in just before Sophie's health declined," one quote read. "Then suddenly she's the sole heir." Doesn't smell right. Below that, a comment thread already stretched past 100 replies. Some folks expressed confusion, a few questioned the article's integrity, but most had already made up their minds. Family is earned, not inherited, one person posted. She manipulated that poor woman. Bet she's laughing in that Cadillac right now. I didn't respond. I didn't type, defend, or clarify. I took a screenshot, saved the article URL, and whispered, "This is how they want to play it?" It wasn't just gossip anymore. They'd taken this public, the same way they'd erased me from the funeral list, from the obituary, from the family history. They were now trying to erase the truth. But the dirt they threw? I knew how to plant in it. Later that morning, I drove into town for fencing materials. The general store sat on Main, its flag flapping half-heartedly in the wind. I parked at the far end of the lot. The second I opened the door, I felt it. Conversation thinning like soup left too long on the stove. Two women standing near the dog food section froze mid-chat. One of them tilted her head, leaned toward the other, and said, just loud enough, "She's the one, the thief." I didn't flinch. I walked past them, grabbed what I needed, and headed toward checkout. Behind the counter, Dale, who'd known me since I was a teenager, lifted his eyes, then looked back down at the register like it had offended him. He scanned the fencing staples, gloves, and a roll of barbed wire slower than usual. Finally, as he bagged the last item, he said, "Just be careful what you say around here. Folks are wound up." I met his eyes. I'm not the one spinning stories. He didn't reply. On the way out, I spotted a flyer tacked to the corkboard near the door. Women in Ag Empowerment Event, honoring Sophie Wise. Dell's face smiled in the corner, mid-laugh, holding a shovel in soft focus. I ripped it down, folded it twice, and shoved it in my coat pocket. They weren't just taking the land, they were taking her name. Back at the truck, I sat with the engine running, hands on the steering wheel. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. But my chest felt like it was stuffed with sand. "This isn't about the will anymore," I whispered. "It's about who gets to tell the story." Driving home, the highway stretched like an open wound. I watched the fields roll by, the same fields I'd helped irrigate when Sophie was recovering from knee surgery, the same fence I'd patched last spring. None of it mattered now. Not to them. All it takes is a name in print, I thought. Doesn't matter who fed the horses during a snowstorm or fixed the gate during harvest. I remembered Sophie once saying, "Small towns have long memories and short compassion." It hadn't meant much then. It meant everything now. Halfway home, I pulled over near a pasture that backed into the hills. I stepped out and leaned against the truck bed. The cattle grazed in the distance, unaware. They didn't read newspapers. They didn't scroll comment sections. They just trusted whoever showed up. I stayed there a while, breathing, listening. I wasn't going to beg for approval, not from people who chose spectacle over truth. Let them whisper. Let them share that article and nod like they'd always known better. I wasn't here to convince anyone. I was here to protect what she gave me. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and printed the article. I highlighted every lie in red, underlined every phrase that twisted reality. Then I pulled out Sophie's ledger, the one she kept behind the grain bins, and flipped through pages. Monthly donations to women's shelters, notes on land maintenance, lists of visitors, most of them blank, except for my name. I opened a clean journal and started a timeline. What Sophie had said, what she wrote, who had witnessed. What documents backed it up? I folded the article and tucked it into a folder labeled Noise. Then I wrote a message to Nora. Subject line, need to talk ASAP. Body. They're preparing to bury me while I'm still standing. I'm not going down in silence. Before I turned in for the night, I picked up one of Sophie's old pens, heavy in the hand. I didn't write anything poetic. Just a sentence I needed to see in ink. They can distort my name, but they'll never twist hers. If they were building a case in the court of gossip, I'd build mine for the court of truth. I was replacing a busted latch on the western paddock gate when the courier truck rolled up the driveway. He didn't even get out, just waved a large white envelope through the open window and shouted, "Phoebe True?" I nodded and wiped my hands on my jeans before taking it. There was no return address, no branding, just a dense, official weight in my palm that told me exactly what it was before I opened it. I didn't read it right away. I walked it into the barn, set it down on the workbench, and looked at it like it might explode. Then I sliced it open with the edge of a rusted hoof pick. Formal notification, civil suit, Sterling Estate, represented by Delilah Sterling and Michael Sterling, plaintiffs, alleging undue influence, psychological manipulation, coercion of a mentally compromised elder. They didn't just come for the land, they came for my name, for the person Sophie had said out loud, on paper, was hers. I stared at the words until they blurred into a smear of cowardice and ambition. Then I placed the letter down and walked out of the barn, letting the wind do whatever it wanted with the air. I called Nora as I leaned against the fence post Sophie used to sit on when she needed a break. "They've officially declared war," I said, voice calm. "Let's make sure they remember who started it." The next day, I drove into Casper with a file box full of receipts, journals, and ranch maintenance logs that Sophie kept down to the hour. Nora's office was all business, no music, no small talk. We sat across from each other like two generals mapping a battlefield. She'd already read the lawsuit. "You're not going to like this," she said. "But they filed under premeditated manipulation. They're leaning hard on the mental decline narrative." I opened Sophie's old voice recorder without saying a word. It still smelled faintly of cedar and dust. I hit play and fast-forwarded until I hit the folder marked January 12th. The audio cracked for a second before smoothing into voices, familiar ones. "Dell. We'll make sure she gets nothing. No land, no title, just silence. Dad. She never was one of us. Sophie's confused. We need to protect the family from this." The tape ended abruptly. Nora didn't blink. "This was 3 weeks before Sophie died," I said. She leaned back, eyes sharp. "This could undo their entire claim," she murmured. "But we'll use it when it matters most." I nodded. My anger had cooled into something more dangerous. Clarity. This wasn't about Sophie's will. It was about power, and they didn't like losing it to the one they thought they'd buried under shame. The next day, I met with Connor and Bree at the ranch. We sat under the shade of the back porch, lemonade in cracked mason jars, Murphy asleep at our feet. "I'm not saying anything official yet," I said. "But things are about to get loud." Connor set his glass down. "You want me to talk? I saw you out there every morning. I saw Sophie hug you when you thought no one was looking. I saw the others. Not once." Bree chimed in. "If this goes public, you need people who saw the real picture, not the one they're trying to paint." "I know," I said, "and I'm grateful. But I'm not just gathering support. I'm documenting presence." I started a list in my notebook that night, names of every ranch hand who'd come by in Sophie's final 6 months, the vet tech who delivered meds weekly, the local seed vendor who chatted with Sophie about crop rotation while Dell posted beach photos. Beside each name, I marked "Seen with Phoebe" or "Never saw Dell." Facts, not sentiment, not arguments. "Calm is a superpower," Sophie had once said, "when the world expects you to scream." I didn't scream. I documented. By Friday, I'd received another envelope, this one from a regional news site. A journalist requesting comment on the Sterling Estate lawsuit, which Dell had now made public. Of course she did. That's her weapon, perception. I smiled, set the letter down, and dialed Nora. "Don't respond yet. Let her keep going. Let her talk louder. Then I texted Jem, the local journalist who'd stayed quiet, observant. I'll give you the real story, I wrote. Not a quote, the story. Dell had lit a match thinking I'd panic, but if they wanted smoke, I'd give them fire, on my terms. The courthouse in Casper wasn't grand, no towering pillars or marble floors. It smelled like floor polish and paperwork, but to me, it felt like the edge of a cliff. I walked through the doors with Nora beside me, her briefcase clutched in one hand, calm carved into her features like stone. I kept my jaw set, my steps measured, my breath steady. Dell stood near the far end of the hall with our father, both dressed like this was a press conference instead of a legal proceeding. Her hair was slicked back, her blazer tailored sharp enough to cut. Photographers snapped from the side, catching the drama they'd come for. A reporter asked, "Any comment on today's hearing?" But she gave them a smile that wasn't a smile and turned away. Inside, the gallery filled quickly. Locals, a few faces I recognized from the market, maybe even the postmaster's wife. People who'd grown up with our family, or thought they knew it. They all leaned forward, waiting to see the spectacle. The judge entered. Stern, gray-haired, no patience for theatrics. He addressed the room, acknowledging the matter at hand, the contesting of Sophie Wise's will on grounds of elder coercion and manipulation. Dell's attorney was quick to move. He painted me as a lurking presence, someone who had slowly inserted herself into Sophie's world under the guise of affection. He referenced the obituary, the public perception, the claim that Sophie had changed dramatically after I returned to the ranch. I sat silently, legs crossed, hands folded. I didn't even blink when they used words like predatory and calculated. Let them write the fiction first, then I'd hand over the truth. When Nora stood, she didn't pace. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if the truth didn't need speed. She requested the court's permission to submit a sealed letter into evidence, a letter postmarked prior to Sophie's passing, verified by handwriting experts, unopened until this moment. The judge gave a curt nod. Nora opened the envelope gently and began to read. I am of sound mind. This land belongs to Phoebe, because she is the only one who never asked, never demanded, and never left. You could hear the room holding its breath. Dell looked down, her lips tight. Our father's fingers clenched the edge of the table, his knuckles turned white. Nora finished reading and submitted notarized documentation that verified both the timing and authenticity of Sophie's signature. A sworn affidavit from the notary was attached. There was no loophole to question. I watched the court reporter's hands as they captured every word. This was it. This was the day history started over. Then Nora said, calmly, Your Honor, we also request permission to play an audio recording. It's from Sophie's personal recorder, recorded by her, retained in her office. We believe it provides her voice on her intentions, directly. Dell's team objected, of course. Claimed lack of context, questioned integrity, but Nora presented a timestamp and chain of custody logs. The judge reviewed, tapped his fingers twice, and nodded. Proceed. Nora set the recorder on the desk and hit play. At first, only static. Then her voice, Sophie's, came through, soft but clear. If you're hearing this, I'm likely gone. That means there's a fight happening. People in the courtroom shifted in their seats. I chose Phoebe, not because she asked. She never did. I chose her because she loved this land when there was nothing left to gain. She watered vines in drought. She fixed fence posts when her hands bled. She never expected anything back, and I watched. There was a pause, as if Sophie took a breath. If they try to take it from her, let this recording be my answer. I chose her, entirely. You could have heard a pen drop. A woman in the back, one of the ranch co-op organizers, wiped a tear with the edge of her coat sleeve. 2 rows ahead, someone exhaled like they'd been holding it for a week. Dell shifted. She didn't look up. Our father closed his eyes and leaned back like the air had been punched out of him. I didn't cry. I didn't move. I simply nodded once. Not to them, but to Sophie, to the recorder, to the air around me that finally felt like it was mine. The judge didn't rule that day, but he looked directly at Dell's attorney and said, "Intent matters, and from what I've heard today, Ms. Sophie Wise's intent was unmistakable." Case adjourned for review. Court dismissed. I stood, gathered my things, and walked out through a hallway that had been full of whispers when I entered, but was now filled with silence. Not empty silence, respectful, knowing. Jem stood near the exit. She didn't call out, didn't raise her phone. She just nodded at me, mouthed two words, "Well done." Outside, the wind felt lighter. I stepped into it like it was a welcome. My hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the release of it all, from the years I'd kept steady while the world tried to wobble my name loose from its place. This wasn't about the land anymore. Not really. It never was. It was about being believed, about someone saying out loud in a room full of people who doubted you, "She mattered. She always did." They wanted to erase me in court, and I left them with nothing to stand on. The courthouse doors didn't creak the way I expected them to. They opened quiet, smooth, like they knew their part wasn't over just yet. As I stepped out into the cool air, I noticed something different. No one whispered, no eyes darted away. A few heads nodded, some gently, some like they'd been waiting to see if I'd fall apart. I didn't. Bree met me just past the sidewalk, holding a brown paper bag that smelled like fresh cornbread. She handed it to me without a word at first, then said, "Folks are seeing what's real now." I gave her a tired smile. "Real's late to the party," she shrugged. "Sometimes the truth gets lost in the invitations." Jem stood across the street. She didn't call out, didn't raise her phone, just raised her hand once in acknowledgement, subtle but certain. I nodded back. I didn't need a crowd or clapping or anyone pretending they were on my side the whole time. They weren't. But now, they weren't against me either, and that was enough. I stopped by the library before heading back. It was empty except for an older couple reading a local genealogy book in the corner. I didn't go to read. I just sat in the far chair near the window and let the quiet wrap around me like it belonged there. I didn't need to be seen, not today, just still. Sometimes the loudest validation is no one questioning you anymore. That evening, as I was rinsing dishes and listening to Murphy snore under the table, Nora called. "You sitting down?" she asked. "Sort of. What's going on?" A nurse came forward. Maravilla Fields, worked part-time with Sophie last year. I froze mid-wipe. "And?" "She says you were the only one who visited regularly. She has notes, timestamps. She kept logs. Says Sophie gave her a journal entry even." My hand slowly lowered the plate into the drying rack. "She willing to testify?" "If it comes to that," Nora said. "But for now, she's giving us a written statement." "I thought you'd want to meet her." We arranged to meet at a little coffee shop 2 blocks from the courthouse the next morning. I arrived early, ordered a black coffee, and chose a booth in the back. She walked in exactly on time, wearing a navy fleece and jeans, no makeup, hair pulled into a bun like she didn't have time for appearances. "Phoebe?" she asked. I nodded, motioned for her to sit. She slid a folder onto the table. "I don't want to be in the middle of your family, but I won't let truth get trampled either." Inside the folder were photos. Sophie sitting on the porch, wrapped in her cardigan, me standing beside her with a tray of iced tea. Another showed Sophie laughing with Murphy at her feet. A handwritten note read, "Roxy knows the weight of dirt and the worth of quiet." I closed the folder slowly, pressed my hand on top of it. "You didn't have to do this," I said. "You didn't have to show up," she replied. "But you did. Quiet doesn't mean invisible." You didn't have to be loud to be loyal. We sat for a long while after that, not saying much, and somehow it said everything. Later that week, Yonina Holt showed up at my door, Sophie's best friend since childhood. I hadn't seen her since the funeral that tried to forget I existed. She stepped inside, handed me a sealed manila envelope and said, she told me to wait until after court. Inside was a photo I'd never seen. Sophie holding me as a baby, eyes fierce and proud. Behind her, the vineyard rolled out like a promise. There was also a letter, faded but legible. Sophie's words in their familiar slant. If anything happens to me, let them know. Roxy was always my light. Yonina sat with me on the porch while I read it. Did she ever hesitate? Doubt me? Never, Yonina said without blinking. She knew who you were when you didn't. The breeze that passed us wasn't dramatic. It didn't carry any grand finale, but I felt it brush past like a hand across a healed scar. The next morning, I drove out to the ranch's community bulletin board and tacked up a copy of that photo. Beneath it, I wrote the quote in big black ink, "Let no one claim what was never theirs." I didn't post about it, I didn't share it online, but others did. Gem. The vineyard staff, even the bakery across town pinned a copy next to the register. Dell stayed silent. She canceled a local podcast interview. Her Instagram went dark. I didn't expect an apology, and I didn't want one. The truth had its moment. That's all I needed. I wasn't trying to win anymore, but I'd already stopped losing. I was sweeping out the old hay shed when my phone buzzed in my back pocket. It was a voicemail from Jem. Just her voice, quiet, clipped with something between urgency and satisfaction. "You'll want to see this." A kid came forward. I didn't know what that meant until I opened Facebook. There it was, a video posted by Jordan Nichols, a teenager who'd helped around the ranch the previous summer. Ball cap crooked on his head, acne still clinging to his cheeks, but his voice steady. "She used to show up before sunrise," he said, eyes straight into the camera. "Had cookies in the passenger seat, always for Sophie. Even on days when it was cold enough to crack the gate hinges, she'd be there. I saw her. Every week. I never saw Dell. Not once." He didn't embellish, didn't try to make it dramatic. Just truth, delivered with the bluntness only kids are allowed to have. And people listened. The comments started rolling in. I remember seeing her truck parked outside when I drove past on the way to work. She never posted about it, never asked for thanks. That boy's got more guts than our whole town combined. Someone even typed, "Sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it's just a boy remembering cookies." The post spread like dry grass catching flame, not rage, just quiet rebalancing. I watched from my phone while Murphy barked in the distance at a fence post he didn't like, and I let myself smile, just a little. 2 days later, I opened the mailbox and found a note from Bree tucked between circulars and a feed store invoice. No envelope, just a receipt, dated, clipped to a sticky note. "You bought peach jam for Sophie every Thursday." I kept the records. I stood there holding it like it weighed more than the paper it was printed on. I didn't wait. I drove into town and walked straight into Bree's bakery. The bell over the door gave a friendly jingle, but the eyes behind the counter were different now. Curious, not judgmental. She walked out from the kitchen with her apron dusted in flour and hugged me before I could speak. "We all saw it," she whispered against my shoulder. "We just didn't know it mattered until they tried to take it." Later that day, Jem shared a picture of the receipt online. No caption, no hashtags, just the jam, the date, and the handwriting. It said more than any article Dell had pushed in weeks. I didn't post a thing, didn't comment, but the story took on a life of its own, passed around in group chats, reposted by ranchers who'd once kept their distance. The bakery even started handing out jars with labels that read, "For the ones who showed up." Maybe you don't have to speak if you've lived loud enough in silence. Dell canceled her upcoming podcast interview and deleted her most recent posts. 2 days later, I got a short email from Nora. Dell's legal team has withdrawn. No statement issued. They're walking backward, quietly. I stared at the screen for a minute, letting the message settle. Not relief exactly, not celebration either, just steadiness. I called Nora back. "So that's it?" "For now," she said. "Looks like the storm's breaking. You weathered it." I didn't reply. I just nodded, even though she couldn't see me. There's a kind of dignity that doesn't get headlines, the kind that doesn't look like revenge, but feels like a window cracked open after weeks of smoke. "Dignity isn't revenge," I murmured. "It's refusing to be shaken when the truth finally arrives." The next morning, I started organizing Sophie's things. Not out of sadness anymore, just maintenance. One file at a time, one photo, one note. I stacked them into a filing system labeled not memory, but proof. I printed the original article that called me a grifter, highlighted the headline, filed it next to Jordan's transcript and Bree's receipt, because truth wasn't just what people saw, it was what they tried to bury. I didn't shred it, didn't need to. I just made sure it would live alongside what countered it. Then I wrote a letter, not to Dell, not to the town, to myself. "You survived the lie. Now protect the truth." I folded it, signed it, and placed it in the same drawer where Sophie had once hidden her will. Then I closed it, slowly, firmly. They stopped talking, not because they ran out of lies, but because the truth outlived them. I spent that morning going through Sophie's last boxes. The one marked family keepsakes sat in the corner of her guest room, untouched since the day we packed up her closet. I pulled it forward, sat cross-legged on the floor, and started sorting. Inside were postcards from road trips she never took, photos of cousins who never showed up, and one particular frame that made my hands pause. It was of me, maybe 6 or 7, sitting on Dell's lap, her arms wrapped around me like she was doing it for the camera more than for comfort. Her smile looked real, mine didn't. I studied the photo, then flipped it over. No writing, no date. I placed it aside, not into the trash, but not on display either. I used to think silence meant defeat, that staying quiet meant surrendering space I should have fought to claim. But Sophie taught me that silence can be a form of ownership, of boundaries, of choice, of peace. I pulled out a blank piece of paper from the ledger drawer and started writing. And it wasn't a letter I planned to send. It wasn't even a goodbye. "Dad, I don't forgive you," I wrote. "But I also don't follow you anymore." I folded the page neatly and slid it into the back of Sophie's notebook, the one where she used to log rainfall and harvest yields like they were scripture. Then I stepped outside and inhaled the air like it hadn't belonged to me in decades. That same afternoon, after a trip to town for feed and fuel, I returned to find Dell's car parked near the fence line, not up at the house, just outside the gate. The engine was off, windows up. She didn't get out. I parked behind her but gave her space, then walked up on foot. Her window came down slowly. "You made me look like the villain," she said flatly. I crossed my arms. "I didn't make you do anything." She stared out at the vineyard, lips pressed together. "You won. You happy?" "No," I said. "I'm free. That's better." She gave a quiet exhale, not quite a sigh. "You don't even feel bad for how this turned out?" "I feel bad that you still think this was about winning." She didn't apologize. That would have been too clean, too easy. But for once, she didn't try to talk over me. She looked tired, not from guilt, but from losing the narrative she thought she'd controlled. "I don't know who you think you are now," she said. "I know exactly who I am," I replied. Without another word, she turned the key and drove away. I didn't look back. The next morning, I walked into Bree's Bakery to pick up a custom order for the ranch crew. It wasn't about appearances, it was about showing up. A neighbor held the door for me, nodding as I passed. "You were right, he said. "We just didn't see it." I thanked him, not because I needed the validation, but because he needed to say it. I carried the boxes of jam bars and cinnamon twists back to the truck and paused before getting in. The town hadn't changed overnight. But something had shifted. I wasn't a whisper anymore. I was someone people made room for. That evening, I walked the vineyard alone. The sun had just dipped behind the hills, leaving streaks of gold and lavender across the horizon. The breeze moved softly between the rows, brushing against my sleeves like a reminder that time keeps passing, no matter who stays or goes. This land never asked who I was. It just asked what I'd do with it. I crouched near one of the younger vines, checked the moisture, adjusted a tie, and stood back up. The roots were taking. Slow, steady. Like me. Success isn't what you get. It's what you walk away from. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of lemon tea and opened a fresh journal. This one wouldn't be for evidence. It would be for me. I wrote down every lesson Sophie left behind. I wrote about the silence that held more than any speech. I wrote about rage that turned into discipline, grief that bloomed into clarity. Then I pulled out the deed to the ranch, official, notarized, heavy with my name. I signed the final acknowledgement, slid it into the envelope, and placed a second copy into Sophie's file with a sticky note on top. "This name holds now. You can rest." I walked to the mantel, lit a small candle beside her photo, and placed a card in front of it. Nothing long, just, "No need to fight anymore. We grew what they tried to burn. No noise, no vengeance. Just a quiet room, a steady pulse, and a life that no longer asked for permission." That night, for the first time in a long while, I slept without waking to worry. They left noise. I chose the kind of silence that grows things. The clerk's office in Rollins was quieter than I expected for a Tuesday. No waiting line, no murmurs from angry landowners, just the buzz of a copier in the corner and the sharp click of Nora's heels on tile. She handed me the final document, a trust transfer form bearing Sophie's estate seal. Next to it, a clause I hadn't seen before. "Non-contest trigger," Nora explained. "Activated by Dell's public media campaign. Her legal rights to the estate are permanently dissolved." I read it slowly, not for the content. I already knew what it said, but for the meaning it carried. This wasn't revenge. It was restoration. I signed my name with a calm hand. Not triumphant, not bitter, just still. "You don't win by shouting," I murmured. "You win by outlasting." As we walked out, I felt the air shift, like the final door had closed, quietly, behind me. A week later, the Sophie Wise Foundation held its first launch meeting in the town library's back room. There was no podium, no banner. And just 3 folding tables, a coffee urn, and a tablecloth that Bree insisted on pressing the night before. I handed out seed packets as people walked in, each tied with a ribbon and a note that read, "Let the things they tried to destroy be what grows next." Jem stood near the back, jotting notes for her article. She didn't ask me to speak. She knew I wouldn't. Bree brought peach jam cookies, the kind Sophie liked on cloudy days. Maravilla donated first aid kits with the foundation logo printed on each one. Even Jordan, the teen who stood up for me when others stayed silent, came by to paint the barn wall later that week. On it, he and a few local artists painted Sophie's quote in gold. "Don't ask to be written in. Just keep showing up until they can't write around you." I stood beneath it with my clipboard, checking inventory for our next supply run. No ceremony, no ribbon cutting, Just the kind of legacy that breathes through action, not applause. One afternoon, a message from Nora came through. I didn't need to open it to know what it was, but I did anyway. Dell filed for personal bankruptcy. A sponsor dropped her after the verdict circulated wider than expected. A second message from Jem followed, attaching a link to a blog post Dell had quietly uploaded, then deleted. It was part confession, part justification. She never named me, but it didn't take much reading to know who she meant. I read it once, then closed the tab. "You tried to bury me," I whispered, "but you ended up under the weight of your own lies." I texted Nora. "Don't tell me if she ever apologizes. I don't need it." And I meant it. The real triumph wasn't in her collapse. It was in my disinterest. I hadn't won by proving anything to her. I had won by no longer needing her to look my way. Later that week, I walked the vineyard at dusk, Sophie's old hat shielding my face from the sun, clipboard tucked under one arm, boots cutting steady tracks between rows. I stopped near the old fence line, the one we used to patch every spring. The hills rolled ahead like open arms, golden under the late-day sky. They gave me nothing but silence, so I learned to make silence into soil. Back at the house, I stood before the wall where Sophie used to hang her calendar and pinned up 2 items side by side, a framed copy of her final handwritten letter and the original printed smear article that called me a grifter. Not out of bitterness, but balance. The words that tried to destroy me and the words that protected me, each had their place. The story didn't end in reconciliation. It didn't need forgiveness to find closure. It found it in the steadiness of breath, the return of trust in my own name, and the way the vineyard grew, unconcerned with who watched or who doubted. The house was still now, not silent with tension, but quiet with clarity. No ghosts left in the walls, just wind, light, and time. They came to erase me. I built something they'll never be able to touch.